pleasure to have you here. Very nice having met you here in Colombia during the summer. And thanks for accepting this. It's an open seminar from Quantil. And that's it. You're very welcome. If you could maybe say a couple of words of about your life or your academic experience, that would be great. And you're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for the nice introduction. This talk is called Learning Policies for Decision Making with Causal Machine Learning, the Case of Development Finance. This is joint work with two of my former PhD students. It's not published, so you see like an early results of what we are thinking. To start with, about myself, I've been graduating with a PhD degree in 2015, then went as a postdoc to the UNSW in Sydney, to the National Institute of Informatics in Tokyo. I was as a visitor at CMU in Pittsburgh, became an assistant professor at ETH Zurich, and now I'm heading the Institute of AI Management at LMU Munich. So what we are interested in, interested in our research, or what defines our research, are three elements: information, innovation, and impact. What we do, information, in terms of information, is we really look forward to solving challenges that are data intensive. We look for companies, organizations that have large sources of data or even small sources of data, and we want to leverage them for better decision making. Innovation, second, we not only apply machine learning, but we oftentimes develop new algorithms that can solve specific challenges that couldn't be solved before. And third, it's impact. What I really like to do is to do some stuff where you can say, well, this has an impact on actual decision making. Examples are, for example, during the COVID pandemic, where we helped stakeholders in monitoring in real-time monitoring of the pandemic. We worked together with other companies like McKinsey, Siemens, ABB, Hitachi, and so forth, and really try to implement AI into their chain, into their value chain. So what I'm saying is always we develop, evaluate, and implement AI solutions. In this talk, I would like to go a bit about development aid and development financing. I will start with a short introduction why we need to care about development aid based on the Sustainable Development Goals. Then I'm presenting an approach with causal machine learning that is helpful for decision making, and I give you some early results and some short discussion. I framed this talk in particular like learning policies. So this time we are not interested in a prediction, but into something that helps decisions. And I think that's kind of like always a kind of barrier in practice that we repeatedly see, that oftentimes you have a prediction, it tells you that maybe how likely the future is, but it doesn't tell you like which action you need to take in order to change the course of the future. And so if you take one thing ahead with this should be about decision making, and the tools that I'm presenting is I think more a general purpose framework that can be also leveraged in other settings. I foresee applications in econ, in banks, in central banks, in governments, but also in companies like in marketing that want to target their customers and so forth. So, why do we need to care? The Sustainable Development Goals have been put forward by all members, all United Nations, in order to develop a future that is better for all and for the planet. And a key central theme in these is that leaving no one behind. Let me check, yeah. And the key theme is that leaving no one behind. So we really aim that all parts of the society should benefit and evolve in a more sustainable and better future. The SDGs itself are organized by 70 goals to be met by the year 2030. One is like no poverty, zero hunger, and there are also others like around health. And in one of them is the part also to reduce HIV and AIDS infections. And that's what we do take later as a case study. And in order to reach this leaving no one behind, and that's because that's the guiding principle behind all of these efforts in the Sustainable Development Goals, is to use official development assistance or short development aid. And that is money that is either money or other kind of support activities that are donated by institutions from around the globe to countries or regions in need. As we can see, is that we are talking here not about a small problem with a couple of million US dollars you see on the annual of development aid across years, and it's printed in US billions. And over time, we are speaking here in the last 20 years about more than 1.5 trillion US dollars. So this is like a massive amount of money. And in some cases, well, and of course, given that we are spending such large amounts of money, we want to bring it into those parts where it has the most, where it's most effective, and then can really fulfill the largest needs. So in this case, or in the following, we develop a model that helps this kind of decision making in a data-driven manner with a tool that helps decision makers to locate countries that are in need of aid, and then study how aid is also affecting certain outcomes in the Sustainable Development Goals. What we develop here is a causal machine learning approach, and I think that needs a careful clarification. When I'm talking about causal machine learning, I'm not assuming causality in the first place. I'm not giving you a causal graph and not perfectly saying that this is the causal effect. The area of causal inference with machine learning aims at a specific setting where we want to estimate treatment effects. And so, for example, you give a person a certain medicine, how would that change her expected life expectancy? Is it going up by 1 year, by 2 years, or by 3 years? And of course, that's a kind of standard problem, in particular in statistics and econ, that we have been studied over the last couple of decades over and over again. And we already know that there's a best practice, which is a randomized controlled trial. However, not all cases lend to a randomized controlled trial, and sometimes we want to use existing data in our databases to estimate treatment effects. And so whenever I'm saying causal machine learning, I'm not telling that some of the variables that we're using have a causal effect, but take it as a synonym in the literature to estimate treatment effects. And here we do something special. We now use machine learning to estimate treatment effects. If we run simply a randomized controlled trial, we get something, okay, medicine X has this and this effectiveness. With these new approaches where machine learning is used, we can not only say this is like the average effect of a treatment, but we can tell, okay, this is the very specific effect on patient X or on patient Y. And maybe some patient with certain risk factors might have a larger benefit from a certain medicine, while it's smaller for other patients. And this is one of the strengths of causal machine learning, so that we can really estimate the individualized treatment effect of a patient. And here we're speaking also of heterogeneous treatment effects. We are explicitly assuming that the treatment is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach for treatments, but that there is really a careful, large heterogeneity in the treatment effects. And I think there's also good reason to believe that this is the case for development aid, because there are some countries that are maybe poorer, some countries that have a certain geography, some countries are even additionally hit by other crises at the same time. So there's a good reason to believe that also development aid has a completely heterogeneous treatment effect on SDG outcomes. So that's one reason. And here you see why we need to care a bit of causal machine learning and why we can't use standard machine learning. So if you take one thing with you after this talk is the main message. Sometimes you cannot do certain things with standard machine learning because it's biased. And of course, machine learning is great to predict certain future outcomes, but taking a standard machine learning model, it's not, you cannot really do some kind of what-if analysis. You cannot really change one. In principle, you can. You could use, for example, a machine learning model, change some of the variables and see how that affects the prediction. Take an example. Let's say I have a medicine. I change a bit the dosage of the medicine. How is that changing my life expectancy of a certain patient? In principle, that works, but literature has proven that this is a very biased approach. So I cannot do this kind of like what-if simulations with machine learning models. And one of the issues is that there are some complications that are in this causal graph behind. And one of the examples is, for example, that there are some selection biases. Certain treatments are given to certain patients of certain characteristics. So simply making assumptions how certain treatments will change using a machine learning model cannot account for some selection bias or some other effects in the data, and leads to biased outcomes. So whenever you want to take a machine learning model and you want to do some kind of what-if analysis, you have to be very careful. In terms of terminology, I'm going to refer to all the outcomes of what could be the potential effect of development aid as counterfactual outcomes if these development aids volumes have not been observed. So let's assume you have a country. Let's take Nigeria as an example. Nigeria gets like $100 million. That's my observed treatment. I also have an observed outcome. I know a certain HIV rate. And that's if I try to predict that one, that's my factual outcome because it has been observed in the data and I have a ground truth against which I can do the benchmark my machine learning model. However, if I want to do something like what happens if I'm not having $100 million of US dollars in development aid, but 200 millions, I have to compute somehow the hypothetical outcome, which didn't took place in the history, for which I don't have observations. And that's what we call a counterfactual outcomes, because it's not observed and we don't have data on it. And this is one of the challenges in treatment effect estimation, and in particular in causal machine learning. We want to develop a tool for which we always only have one observation, the factual one, and not the counterfactual one, under the assumption that we maybe would have given a different treatment to a patient. So what we need and what we do in the following is we develop a tailored causal machine learning approach that tries to address these challenges and makes a very precise estimate of the causal effects. And we use observational data because simply doing randomized controlled trials at this scale, where certain countries receive more or less aid, is simply not possible. So that's a good time to ask questions.
I think we can go ahead, Stefan, maybe.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
So in the following, we will do our evaluation with data from the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Still, HIV and AIDS is one of the major causes of death worldwide. It has caused more than 36 million deaths in the past 40 years. We have like more than 1 million new HIV infections annually. And at the same time, a large amount of development aid is being spent on the fight against HIV. Here we're talking about several $100 billion per year that are being spent. On the right-hand side, you see countries with the high HIV infection rate, and in the top one in red, and in the bottom one in green, you see also countries that are large recipients of development aid, so AKA where the money is currently being channeled to. In our case, we now try to model it, and now you also get a better understanding why we call it causal machine learning, because in the first step, we try to understand a bit of the causal graph. And that's the causal graph that we have here on the left-hand side. We have our treatment, our action, that's here in green, called A. We have our outcome variable, which is the HIV infection rate in red. And of course, not all countries are alike, but countries have different country characteristics. And these country characteristics are these variables X that you can see here. And of course, countries, maybe one is the GDP or the wealth of the country. And that, of course, determines how much money a country gets. But at the same time, sort of the wealth of a country also tells you about how good the country in itself is doing for reducing the HIV infection rates. And that's indicated with the arrows here. Then we have our objective. So we want to estimate our outcome variable Y for a certain volume of development aid that is given or that we can determine given a certain country with certain characteristics. In order to be able to estimate it, we have to make some assumptions. These are typically the standard assumptions in the literature: consistency, positivity, and ignorability. I don't want to go into much details here, but one is simply saying that my observed outcome, if I spend a certain amount of money on in a country, then my observed outcome is also really the real outcome, so I don't have any measurement error. Positivity means that that there's no country where no money is being spent, so a certain amount of, it's always likely that a certain amount of money is being spent on a country, so that the probability for a certain volume is never zero. And this kind of modeling, as a more FYI, is also called it means that we are building up in the so-called potential outcomes framework. That means only we now try to predict outcomes, but potential outcomes that would be the likeliest outcome given that we choose a certain treatment. And that's what is called the potential outcomes framework. In this specific setting, and I think this is a very general observation, as we face certain challenges. One is we have a very high dimensional covariate space. So here in our example, this is indicated by the X variables. We would most likely control for GDP. Would like to control for the population size, for the education, for how good the health sector is, etc., etc. So we have comparatively, we maybe have like 10 or a dozen of different variables, but we only have like around 80 countries that are recipient. So that's why I'm saying it's compared to the number of countries, we actually have a fairly high dimensional covariate space. Second problem, we have a treatment selection bias. The treatments and the covariates are not independent. So we cannot simply take this treatment as exogenous. Rather, the treatment depends on a specific country. Simply put, poor countries get more money, richer countries get less money, as an example. And because of this dependency, we have to carefully address it. Third, in our case, we have a treatment that is not binary, but continuous. So we have infinitely many potential outcomes or infinitely many different potential development aid volumes that could be spent. In the literature, there's much literature already trying to estimate treatment effects with binary treatments. For comparison, continuous treatments are comparatively rare. And our fourth challenge is we have a limited sample size. We have 80 countries, around 80 countries, aka we have 80 observations in 1 year. We explicitly don't model it as a time series or pool observations from different years, because we already know that there are some trends and structure breaks in the process. Some countries and donors change from year to year their spending practices, so we cannot really pool up a large data set. We really have to live with the fact that we have a small sample data set. So how do we address them? In our case, we do have developed a method called a counterfactual generator for continuous treatments, in which we want to address all of these three challenges. So the first one is the balancing autoencoder. This one is we use to reduce the dimensionality of the covariate space. Remember, we have these different X variables, roughly a dozen here. So we somehow want to perform a dimensionality reduction and bring it into a smaller space. However, we have treatment selection bias, meaning richer countries get maybe less money, poor countries get more money. So we need to somehow want to address this already in this stage, and somehow want to correct a bit for the treatment selection bias so that our representation is more efficient for subsequent machine learning. Second, we use the counterfactual generator. We want to, in this case, we generate counterfactual outcomes, which is very good in our case because we have a small sample size. And by generating more hypothetical data points, we get the larger data sets and we are better in estimating the overall outcomes. So this can be also viewed like what you know, for example, are generative adversarial networks. We could also use the generative adversarial network in order to generate more synthetic data points and eventually have a model and then use that as data for training our models in order to get more precise estimates in small sample settings. In our case, we don't use the adversarial networks because they are not so stable for small data sets, but we simply generate synthetic twins in a different method. And the last one is our inference model, where we now want to estimate the treatment effect. So we need to sort of simply now estimate the relationship between outcome and treatment given on the covariates. So let's dive a bit into that, into the structure. So what you see here is that we have our training set. You see our observations, roughly n. We have our outcome variable, our treatments, our covariates. And now the first step is our balancing autoencoder. So the balancing autoencoder maps these covariates X onto a lower dimensional representation. So that's why you see here a Z, that's our lower dimensional representation. It has fewer columns, by simply plotting it with fewer columns or less width, we want to show this is lower dimensional. And at the same time, we want to do it in a way that we address a bit for the treatment selection bias. Then our second step is we now generate synthetic data points. And that's our second step here, where we now have a much larger data set. And then we use finally this data set for our actual prediction of the treatment response curve. And that's simply a function that depends on our treatment, our age volume A, and our country control Z, and we get the expected HIV infection rates. All of these things, in essence, are not per se, I would not say are not groundbreaking, to be honest. But of course, simply pooling them in this manner, we have not seen before. And we did also some benchmarking against state-of-the-art tools for treatment effect or for estimating heterogeneous treatment effects with continuous variables. But some of them have challenges that are in our specific setting with small data sets, high dimensional covariates are simply not as effective as our tool here.
Sorry, Stefan.
Yeah.
One question. How do you deal with, in step one, the observations you have for different time periods? Are they...
Mm-hmm. Good question. Very good question. So what we do is we forget about all historic data points and we really use only one year for all of our estimation. Later in our experiments, we only use data from 2017 for training and 2018 for evaluation. We don't use multiple years. You could also say, Stefan, why don't you simply use the data from 2017, 2016, and 2015 for training? Then you have more data points, but there's some kind of domain shift going on. Some of the relationships and the causal effects have changed over time, and it simply doesn't give us as good estimates. So that's why we only use 1 year data from 1 year exactly 80 data points, one for each country for 1 year, and all points from all countries from the same year for training.
Good, thanks.
So the first one is an autoencoder. We use an autoencoder in the standard way. That's what we learn, a representation phi here, that we have a slightly different objective. We not only want to have that the autoencoder, let's get to the figure here again. Here you see a standard autoencoder. We have our covariates getting in, and of course we want the autoencoder maps them to a lower dimensional representation, maps them back, and they should be sufficiently good to the original one. But we somehow have our second objective in the loss function, so that our representation should not necessarily be predictive of the treatments, so that they're independent of the treatments. And that's why we use a very custom loss function here. Then we have the counterfactual generator that generates synthetic data points. And there we simply generate synthetic twins. What we do is we simply assume different treatments over a grid. We simulate data points and we generate them. For computation efficiency, we have solved it by an optimization problem, but it's really simply very standard way of making these predictions.
Stefan, sorry, may I ask you a question about the first? So you penalize for making good predictions?
No, I mean, we want to make good predictions. That's what you're seeing here, the autoencoder loss in the standard setting. So we want to really be very close. What comes in the autoencoder and what comes out should have after the second decoder and after the encoder decoder step should be very close to the original representation. But we do a certain loss that these kind of representations should not necessarily predict our treatments.
So that's very interesting. And is this common to do this kind of thing?
Yes, there are some ideas, and that's what I'm saying. Many of these ideas have been developed earlier, and in that case, it's different works, in particular from the group by Michaela van der Schaar from the University of Cambridge, that they use very balanced, what they call balanced representation. And the idea in this kind of balanced representation is to have to learn a representation with like a second adversarial objective. In our case, it should not be predictive of the treatments. That's a typical one, and that typically helps to find a representation that is not confounded by a treatment selection bias any longer, but that is more generalizable. There is also in particular the work, a paper by Bicker, for example, that have developed it earlier in a different other settings for binary treatment. And it's often the case that these, for the binary setting, there's also a certain theory that tells us if we do this, we actually get a better, we are better in learning the objective. So that's also with the theoretical foundation.
Yeah, great.
Stefan, I have a question.
Yeah.
That theta, how do you calibrate data, or how do you say what data is?
That's here is simply a hyperparameter, simply from what you also see in other loss functions, like for example in the lasso, you have a lambda or alpha depending on the naming, and we do a simple hyperparameter search over this again.
Okay, thanks.
So in the second one, we now do our synthetic treatments. We developed it with an optimization problem. But what you see from the optimization problem here is essentially we simply do a linear prediction. We simply use now different treatments, alpha, tilde that we generate. We give some covariates. We learned it on our existing data, and based on a linear relationship on the existing data, we make some predictions for also new synthetic twins, where we have the same country covariates that we already have, but with different treatments, and now predict different outcomes, counterfactual outcomes. Again, this is an idea also from adversarial learning that has been used, and some of the benchmarks is a paper called Saigon by the group from Michaela van der Schaar. This is a very cool method. With one of the main differences is that this method uses adversarial learning, and of course in a small sample setting as ours, this is not really possible. Instead, synthetic twins are better. This is also very good questions. How is this related to a synthetic control method? I would say it's somewhat similar, but with a different purpose. Here, we are trying to estimate treatment effects that are more in the future that help us. How would it be for a country if we give now a development aid in the future? Synthetic control is similar to other tools like diff and diff. It's a very retrospective different methods. You ask the questions, how was my treatment effect in the past, and not what will be the treatment effect if I do this in the future. And I think that's kind of the main difference between the two methods. We use many synthetic twins. In the synthetic control method, you only have one that is used for controlling, where the synthetic control is more like a counterfactual outcome in itself. In our case, it's really a synthetic twin where it's really more close, I would say shares more similarities with generative adversarial learning.
Stefan, this X, big X is the features you learned from the first step, right?
Yes.
And then what is the Y?
Those are some kind of coefficients. So it's a linear prediction or a lasso prediction or elastic net prediction. W are my coefficients. And now we simply predict, we learn our existing data with existing variables. And we simply learn now new predictions on simply simulate from a linear or from elastic net that we trained.
Yeah, but I mean the last line, which you have this Y. Yes.
This
how do you get it? Yeah. Well, this big Y, where does it come from?
Those are then simply my that's not nicely written. Those should be, I think, my X. These are simply my outcome predictions. Sorry, it needs to be written as X.
Okay. Good.
So now we have more variables, more counterfactual outcomes that are a bit noisy, but we have more, and often that helps for learning. And in the third step, we want to learn now our actual machine learning model, our inference model, that given a treatment, given my country covariates, predicts the outcome. Here we use the method that is already existing, that's called generalized propensity score methods. I don't want to give much into details, but in the most important way, it learns a polynomial, in our case, a second degree polynomial, in order to predict the outcomes, and it does so a bit by balancing. So these steps that we put together, again, I'm very transparent. I think the whole idea, putting it all together in this kind of framework idea, I think is the novelties. Many of these ideas have been already developed, but I think what we show is that this can actually be very helpful in an applied setting. We did then some kind of experiments. In the first step, we started with semi-synthetic data, and then we demonstrate the applicability of our method with real-world data. Why do we use semi-synthetic data? So this is, we really generate or simulate data now in the first step. And that's to benchmark our methods. We do so because we want to know whether we can really recover the ground truth causal effects. And the problem is, or the fundamental problem is in causal machine learning, you never know what would happen, what would be the outcome if you have taken a different path. If you drive on the street, you never would know if you take route A to your target to getting home. You know already, if you take it afterwards, you know how long it took you, but you never know what would have been the time if you have chosen a different path to drive home. And that's kind of the fundamental problem in causality, or in particular in causal machine learning. And so that's why we can otherwise only use the factual data, the one we observed, the route A of driving home. But to address this, we use simulate data, and there we know the ground truth causal effects, and we can do our benchmark. We call it semi-synthetic data because we use our actual real-world data that we have, our actual real-world covariates, our actual development aid volumes, but we simply, on top of that, simulate a treatment effect with some nonlinear function. So we still have the ground truth distributions. Some of these distributions are skewed, etc., but we still add or simulate a treatment effect on top of it so that we can know the ground truth. Then we benchmark it. And here we cannot use the standard like mean squared error because in the end we have different, we could do this for different development aid volumes. And what we do is we simply use a grid of different development aid volumes when simulating the data, 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, 40 millions. And in the end, we now, of course, have to integrate or sum over all of these individual predictions and then see how good this is overall. That's why we use a mean integrated squared error that accounts for the fact that we have maybe different treatments with different aid volumes in the end. So here you can see the results. What you see on the left-hand side are some couple of baselines. Saigon is one from the literature that's based on an adversarial network, or generative adversarial network. Because of that one, it really is, while it's in general fairly similar to our work, the main difference is this generative adversarial network, and that just cannot really work very well in the small sample size settings. I would assume in a different, like really large data set, that might be very much to the advantage of this method. We use other baselines. We simply use the neural network that you can see here, a random forest or linear model. These have not been corrected for this treatment selection bias. Here we have other methods from the literature from causal machine learning. And what you can see is that our method outperforms them on semi-synthetic data. Then we use real-world data. And again, you see that we are roughly 3 percentage points better in the root mean squared error. But for real-world data, we can only use the actual observed data points. So we cannot simply, we can only use the observed aid volumes as they have been decided by countries in the past, not hypothetical ones. But what we see is here that our method is sufficiently robust to learn and make inferences.
Sorry, Stefan, question.
Yeah.
But how do you make these methods comparable in the sense that you still have some parameters to fix in your method?
All of them have hyperparameter. We do a very fair hyperparameter tuning for all of them according to best practice. And then we simply do standard benchmarking.
Okay.
And what you see is here, for example, again, this is like a standard neural network, standard random forest. GPS is this generalized propensity score, which is also the last step of our method, but without the additional adversarial, without the synthetic twins, and without this balancing autoencoder. So you can really see that the improvement from the GPS to ours is really due to the improvements that we do by having synthetic twins and so forth.
Great, thanks.
Here comes actually why I'm saying how do we want to do help decision making. What you see here are different 6 countries, example countries. On the x-axis, you see the development aid in million US dollars. On y, you see the expected relative reduction in the HIV rates. So take the example top left. South Africa is one of the countries with one of the highest HIV rates across the world. If we would, so for example, spend 500 million, we would reduce the HIV infection rate by 8%. If we, however, spend 600 million, we would probably reduce the HIV infection rate by 10%. And the dashed line is the currently observed as the current volume or money volume that is being spent on a country as development aid. And now decision makers can use this and say, well, now let's say your budgets rise by a couple of millions. You can now see which countries would benefit most from this and where you can make the largest impact. You can also see how effective it is in certain countries. And what you see is also that the effectiveness of development aid varies greatly across countries. And we see that some countries like Mozambique, it's much smaller than in South Africa due to various other reasons, like development status, the effort that the country is doing themselves, like how much money they spend in the health sector, in educating people, and so forth. So this is what we regard here as the main outcome of our methods. This, if in principle, you could also, as I mentioned, to wrap it up a bit, you could also do it with standard machine learning, but then your these treatment response curves would be biased because of some selection bias, and this should not be the case with our method. We did then a hypothetical analysis, like, well, let's take the same amount of aid that we currently have, use our estimated treatment response curves, and now optimize it in a way that we maximize the reduction in HIV infections worldwide. So this would lead to a different allocation of development aid across country, but most likely to one that is more effective. And we see in this simulation that one could reduce roughly the number of HIV infections by 3% or 50,000 cases simply by rearranging the development aid allocation. So at zero additional cost, just trying to figure out an allocation that is more effective. So to wrap it up, I hope you had I have introduced you to, hopefully to a new theme of causal machine learning, where we estimate the effect of treatments, or where we use machine learning to predict the effects of certain treatments. In our case, we developed a new framework that is really targeted to many decision-making settings that we see in the economy, in the policy sector, in industry, where we have many high-dimensional confounders, we have treatment selection by a small sample size, etc., etc. We hope that this method is also informing other stakeholders in maybe revising or their current allocation practice, but at the same time, simply, I think one of the main thing we hope for is to have more transparency by seeing how really aid works in countries where it's interesting. Of course, as with all research, in particular one that has a medical spin, our work has limitations. Simply as doing many of these evaluations are challenging because we don't have ground truth values. We can only observe one outcome, not all of them. And that's, of course, very challenging for benchmarking. These kind of models in causal machine learning, they have certain assumptions that may be violated. I think the risk in our case is comparatively low, but they rely on mathematical assumptions. And of course, if I do a hypothetical simulation of how development aid would be reduced with a different allocation, this should be really considered as a hypothetical setting. We know that there are many idiosyncrasies, that there are some preset commitments, there are political aims why development aid is being sent to certain countries and not others. Of course, I know that this cannot be it should not be simply put into practice, but it should rather inform decision makers in a human in the loop approach. Now it's time to ask for more questions. While you're collecting questions, feel free to also connect, follow our group on LinkedIn, on Twitter, stay connected, and you will see, of course, of our research that we also develop and how we want to bring causal machine learning into practice.
Fantastic, Stefan. I have 3 questions related to your final results. If you just run a regression on outcomes, investment in HIV and covariates, let's say for some reason you get the same results you have in your graph. It could be the case that you did everything here, but still just a regression would have given you the same stuff. I mean, the other graph, the impact on each country. And so one could argue that what this does is to give guarantees that in fact it is a causal effect, and it is this method that guarantees that, although the results are the same to a standard regression.
I mean, we are in particular, so of course it's with this outlier method, you see already that we're here that this is more like a 10%, almost 10% improvement over a simple linear model. And we already know that there's this treatment selection bias. So we know that the linear model gives biased treatment or can give biased outcomes. There might be settings, others than ours, where both methods are similar. That could be the case if we don't have this treatment selection bias or something because of various settings. And yes, maybe there are settings where it isn't, but in our case it is. So simply using the linear model might give otherwise biased estimates.
Yeah, but just show the next one, the one in which you have the right here. So I could have run a regression, and because I'm lucky, I can maybe I get the same results, almost the same.
But I would always argue, so that's why I don't do it, and we never analyzed it, and that's also fairly common in the literature. I first sort of show in this case the linear model has this limitation, and that's why we stopped using it for all of our insights.
Okay. Well, and my last question is, well, it looks like it's a very general method. You can do this in many observational data sets and just work out the causal effect. Yeah,
that's our hope, to be honest. I would love, of course, having now maybe a student that does a similar analysis with maybe like interest rates of central banks or other decisions that governments take. I think that could be it could be a bit more of a general purpose tool. I'm still looking for the students who would like to test it, and I think I'm really excited to try it and to give it a try. Maybe this could maybe we find actually good support that it also works very well in other cases.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. Great. I learned a lot. So I don't know who else has a question.
I have a question. I think it might be a naive question, but how do you generate this uncertainty, these confidence intervals or so in?
Yeah, that's a bootstrapped one. We have run, I hope I'm not mistaken, but I think we have run like 50 iterations around it.
Okay, okay. Interesting, because you see an interesting diversity between countries. So some of them are pretty tight and some are pretty ample.
Yeah, that can be. I guess it's of course a bit more guessing yet now to find very clear reasons. But I think over time we have seen patterns that also match like political events and things that many of our colleagues are also aware from simply from the reading newspapers.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
So more questions? Well, it was great. Fantastic, Stefan. I love it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. If you feel free to stay connected. If there are more questions, ping me, email, LinkedIn, whatever, Twitter, as you prefer. And thanks for having me.
We'll
Great.
do something with this method here in Colombia. I think we can do it for a very nice data set we have of health expenditures for the whole population in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be great.
Yeah,
Okay.
Daniel, yes, you have to please ping me via email, best, or LinkedIn.
Great. Thank you.
Let me write in. That's my email address. There we go. Good. Okay.
Okay, Stefan. Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Take care.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.